In the cold, isolated village nestled deep within snow-capped mountains, the air always seemed to hang heavy with silence. Eleanor's cottage, a modest structure of stone and timber, sat at the edge of the forest, far removed from the central cluster of homes. This distance from the village was not entirely geographic. It was symbolic, an echo of Eleanor's withdrawal from the world. Her life had not always been this way. Once, she had shared this cottage with her husband, Arthur, a warm and steadfast man who filled the space with laughter and stories. The scent of his pipe tobacco used to linger in the corners of the room long after he had finished smoking, blending with the aroma of the firewood crackling in the hearth. Arthur's laughter, however, had been silenced many winters ago by an illness that claimed him with swift, merciless hands. Now, only the creak of the floorboards under her weight and the groan of the wind against the window panes punctuated the silence. She could go days without speaking a word. Sometimes, Eleanor wondered if she would even recognize the sound of her own voice. The pain of Arthur's absence was compounded by the estrangement of her son, Daniel. Once her pride and joy, Daniel had left the village years ago, chasing ambitions that seemed to shrink Eleanor into insignificance. Their conversations had grown sparse, trickling down from letters that dwindled in frequency to a few curt phone calls, and eventually complete silence. She hadn't heard from him in years. The grief of his absence was sharper than the cold that seeped into her cottage, cutting her to the core each time she passed the photograph of him on the mantel, a boy of 12 smiling brightly beside his father. Eleanor's days were regimented by routine, simple acts of survival and preservation. She would wake at dawn, the faint light spilling through frosted windows, and bundle herself in layers before stepping outside. Her breath formed visible clouds as she trudged through the snow to fetch firewood or tend to the small vegetable garden that stubbornly clung to life beneath the frost. These moments outside her home were solitary but peaceful in their own way, as the natural world carried on around her. The soft crunch of her boots against the snow and the distant hoot of an owl provided the only companionship. Inside, her cottage was meticulously kept, each object in its place, as though the order might stave off the chaos of loneliness. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries and photographs that felt more like reminders of loss than cherished memories. A blanket Arthur had once favored lay neatly folded over the back of an armchair. She never used it, though it still carried faint traces of his scent. Her evenings were the hardest. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the shadows grew longer, and the cold seeped in through cracks in the stone walls. Eleanor would light a fire in the hearth and sit by its warmth, knitting or reading from one of the old books that lined her shelves. But as the hours dragged on, the silence became oppressive, a weight she could not lift. The absence of voices, of laughter, of companionship pressed down on her. She often found herself staring into the flames, her mind drifting to memories of a life she could no longer touch. Sometimes she would speak aloud, as though Arthur might hear her. "The snow came early this year, Arthur. The garden will be hard to keep," she might say, her voice trembling with the effort. Or, "I saw the fox again this morning, near the woods. It's grown bold, that one." These words dissolved into the air, unanswered, but they filled the void for a fleeting moment. Despite the weight of her solitude, Eleanor's resilience was unyielding. She did not wish for pity or intrusion, though she longed for connection. The villagers, well-meaning as they were, had stopped visiting regularly, their lives busy with their own families and concerns. When they did come, bearing gifts of preserves or bread, Eleanor would greet them warmly, but there was always a sense of distance. They spoke to her as though she were fragile, a relic of another time, and she hated it. On rare occasions, Eleanor ventured into the village for supplies. These trips were brief and functional. She would shuffle through the narrow, snow-packed streets, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, avoiding eye contact with the shopkeepers who greeted her with forced cheer. The questions about how she was doing felt more like polite obligations than genuine interest. She would mutter her thanks, pay for her goods, and retreat back to her cottage, where she could shed the mask of composure and sink into the safety of her solitude. At night, her dreams were a cruel paradox. They brought back Arthur and Daniel, vivid and alive, their voices so real that she could almost reach out and touch them. But when she awoke, the aching emptiness of reality would rush back in, leaving her hollow. Some nights, she stayed awake intentionally, unwilling to endure the false comfort of those dreams. In her darker moments, Eleanor wondered what the purpose of her life had become. Her days felt like a repetitive cycle, each one blending into the next with little to distinguish them. She existed rather than lived, her world reduced to the confines of her cottage and the memories it held. Yet, there was a stubborn strength in Eleanor that refused to fade. It showed in the way she tended to her garden despite the odds, in the meticulous care she gave her home, in the effort she made to maintain her dignity even when the world seemed to forget her. She clung to the hope that one day, the silence might be broken, not by the howling wind or the creak of the floorboards, but by the voice of someone who cared. And so, Eleanor's days continued, her life a delicate balance of pain and resilience, silence and yearning. The snow-covered mountains stood as stoic witnesses to her existence, their beauty both a solace and a reminder of her isolation. In their shadow, Eleanor endured, a lone figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. Winter's grip on the mountains tightened, its icy breath seeping through every crack in Eleanor's cottage as the evening descended into a bitter chill. The snow fell relentlessly, thick and heavy, muffling the world outside. Eleanor sat by the fire, knitting with hands stiffened by the cold, though the act was more of a distraction than a necessity. The firelight danced on the walls, casting long shadows that only deepened her loneliness. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the solitude of her life pressed down on her with suffocating weight. As the hours crept on, a faint noise broke through the wind's relentless roar. It was a sound Eleanor couldn't immediately place, sharp, piercing, almost like a cry. She froze, listening, her heart quickening. The noise came again, louder this time, a desperate, high-pitched yelp that tugged at something deep within her. Rising from her chair, she grabbed her thick shawl and lantern, hesitating for a moment before opening the door. The cold hit her like a wall, but she stepped out into the storm, following the sound that seemed to drift on the wind. The snow was deep, swallowing her boots with each step as she trudged toward the treeline. The icy wind whipped her face, but she pressed on, the faint cries guiding her like a fragile thread. Eleanor's breath came in visible clouds, and her fingers, clutching the lantern, were quickly growing numb. What could be out here in such weather? A fox? A wounded bird? The thought crossed her mind that she might find something too far gone to save, but the sound held such desperation that she couldn't turn back. As she reached a small clearing, her lantern's light fell upon a dark shape huddled against the snow. For a moment, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but then it moved, a feeble, shivering motion. Eleanor edged closer, her breath hitching as she realized what it was. A bear cub, no larger than a medium-sized dog, half buried in the snow. Its fur was matted with ice, and its small body trembled violently. The sight struck her like a blow. The cub was utterly defenseless, its dark eyes wide with terror and pain. Eleanor's instincts took over. She set the lantern down and knelt in the snow, reaching out slowly so as not to startle the creature. It flinched at her touch, but was too weak to resist as she carefully wrapped her shawl around its trembling body. The fabric quickly soaked through with melted snow, and she could feel the cub's feeble warmth against her hands. "You poor thing," she murmured, her voice cracking. The cub let out another pitiful cry, its breath faint and uneven. Eleanor's heart ached as she cradled the tiny creature, its weight far lighter than it should have been. It felt fragile, like holding the remnants of a life slipping away. The journey back to the cottage was harrowing. The cub's weight pressed against her chest, and the deep snow made every step an effort. The wind clawed at her, and for a moment, she feared she wouldn't make it. But the cub's faint whimper gave her strength, urging her forward until, at last, the dim glow of her cottage came into view. Once inside, Eleanor placed the cub by the fire, hastily wrapping it in old blankets. Its small body was still trembling violently, and she could see its tiny chest heaving with labored breaths. She fetched a pot of warm water, dampening a cloth to gently wipe away the clumps of ice stuck in its fur. The cub whimpered weakly, but did not resist, its energy too depleted. Eleanor worked with quiet urgency, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the fear that she was too late. Hours passed as she tended to the creature. She found some leftover broth and carefully spooned a few drops into its mouth, encouraging it to swallow. It was a painstaking process, but eventually, the cub's breathing grew steadier. Its dark eyes fluttered open, meeting Eleanor's for a brief, heart-stopping moment before closing again. "You'll make it," she whispered, more to herself than the cub. "You'll be all right. I'll make sure of it." The words felt like a promise, binding her to this fragile life she had plucked from the jaws of death. In the days that followed, Eleanor's life transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She named the cub Theo, a name that seemed to fit his scrappy determination. Theo's recovery was slow and fraught with challenges. At first, he couldn't stand, his legs trembling beneath him whenever he tried. Eleanor had to feed him by hand, coaxing him to eat with soft words and patience. His cries at night were heart-wrenching, a reminder of whatever cruel fate had left him alone in the snow. Eleanor found herself talking to Theo more than she had spoken to anyone in years. "You're stronger than you look, you know," she would say as she rubbed warmth back into his limbs. Or, "I think you're just trying to make me soft, aren't you? Crying like that every night." But beneath her light-hearted words was a profound connection. Theo became a companion in her solitude, his presence filling the emptiness that had long consumed her life. When he began to walk again, stumbling around the cottage on wobbly legs, Eleanor felt a spark of pride she hadn't experienced in years. She found herself smiling at his antics, like the way he would nuzzle in her lap or paw clumsily at the blankets. Yet, there were moments of tension that reminded her of the fragile nature of their bond. One evening, Theo's strength seemed to return all at once, and he knocked over a small table in his excitement. The crash startled Eleanor, and for a brief moment, the old fear crept back in, a fear of losing control, of inviting chaos into her carefully ordered life. But when she saw Theo cowering in the corner, his small body trembling with guilt, her heart softened. "It's all right," she said gently, kneeling to stroke his fur. "It's just a table. Don't look at me like that, silly boy." As the weeks passed, Theo grew stronger, and so did Eleanor. The bond between them deepened, a lifeline for both in the harsh isolation of the mountains. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she thought she had lost forever: purpose. In saving Theo, she had found a reason to keep going. Winter melted slowly into spring, and the harsh snows began to retreat from the mountain village. Eleanor's small cottage, once so quiet and still, now echoed with the sounds of life. Theo, the bear cub she had rescued and nursed back to health, had grown at an astonishing pace. He was no longer the fragile creature she had found trembling in the snow, but a robust, lumbering presence who filled her once empty days with purpose. Yet with Theo's growth came unease, not just for Eleanor, but for the villagers whose whispers about the widow and her wild companion were growing louder. By the time summer arrived, Theo was nearly unrecognizable from the tiny cub she had wrapped in her shawl. His thick fur glistened in the sun, his broad shoulders and powerful frame a testament to his transformation. Yet, despite his size, Theo was gentle. He followed Eleanor like a shadow, his massive paws padding softly behind her as she worked in the garden or fetched firewood. He would sit beside her at the hearth in the evenings, his warm presence a comfort against the creeping memories of her lonely years. But the villagers didn't see Theo as Eleanor did. They saw a monster, a wild bear living unnaturally close to humans, and their fear began to fester. It started with avoidance. Where once Eleanor's occasional visits to the village had been met with polite nods and wary smiles, now they were met with closed shutters and murmured prayers. If she passed someone on the narrow streets, they would hasten to the other side, avoiding her eyes. Even the shopkeepers, who had always greeted her warmly, now served her quickly and without words, their faces tense with unease. Eleanor pretended not to notice, but the rejection stung. She had already been an outsider in the village, a widow living on the edge of the woods, estranged from her son, but Theo's presence had made her a pariah. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to care enough to change things. Theo had become her family, her only companion in a world that had forgotten her. She wouldn't abandon him, no matter what the villagers thought. Her resolve was tested one humid summer afternoon. Eleanor was carrying a heavy basket of vegetables back to her cottage when she noticed Theo trailing behind her, his massive form emerging from the tree line. She stopped and smiled at him, adjusting the basket on her hip. "Come on, lazy boy," she called, her voice light despite the sweat on her brow. "You can't just skulk in the trees all day." Theo let out a low rumble that she had come to recognize as his version of a laugh and lumbered toward her. But just as he reached her side, a sharp cry split the air. Eleanor turned to see a young boy from the village standing a few feet away, his face pale with terror. He had been picking berries, his small hands clutching a basket now forgotten on the ground. His wide eyes were locked on Theo, who stood frozen, his massive head tilted curiously. "Don't be afraid," Eleanor said quickly, stepping between the boy and Theo. "He won't hurt you." But the boy didn't move. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, then back to Theo, his chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. Before Eleanor could say another word, the boy turned and ran, his high-pitched scream echoing through the trees. By the time Eleanor returned to the cottage that evening, the whispers in the village had turned into shouts. The boy's parents had spread the tale of their son's narrow escape from the monstrous bear, and a group of men had gathered in the square, their voices loud with anger. Eleanor could hear their accusations from her kitchen window as she prepared Theo's supper. "It's unnatural keeping a wild animal like that. What happens when it turns on her? Or worse, on one of our children?" Their words twisted in her gut, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wouldn't let their ignorance drive a wedge between her and Theo. She had seen his gentleness, his loyalty. The villagers didn't understand, and perhaps they never would. But the villagers' mistrust didn't stop at words. As Theo grew, so did their hostility. One morning, Eleanor stepped outside to find her garden trampled, the vegetables she had so carefully tended torn from the ground and scattered like debris. A crude sign was staked in the middle of the destruction, its hastily scrawled letters reading, "Send the bear back where it belongs." Eleanor's hands trembled as she knelt in the dirt, gathering the ruined vegetables into her apron. Theo padded up behind her, letting out a low, mournful sound as if sensing her distress. She turned and buried her face in his thick fur, tears burning her eyes. "They don't know you," she whispered. "They don't understand." The humiliation of being targeted by her own neighbors was almost too much to bear. For days, she stayed inside, afraid of what she might find if she ventured out again. But Theo wouldn't let her retreat into despair. He would nuzzle her hand until she smiled or plop his massive body in her path, forcing her to laugh at his antics. Slowly, Eleanor began to rebuild her garden, her defiance growing with each new sprout of life. Her isolation only deepened as the seasons turned. The villagers began to spread wilder rumors, that Theo had attacked livestock, that Eleanor had gone mad and thought she was a bear herself. Some claimed to have seen her wandering the woods at night, speaking to Theo as if he were human. The lies stung, but they also steeled her resolve. Let them talk. She had faced worse in her life. It wasn't until autumn, when a hunter from a neighboring village came through, that things took a darker turn. The man, a burly figure with a rifle slung over his shoulder, knocked on Eleanor's door one evening, his face set in a grim expression. "You're the one with the bear," he said without preamble. Eleanor stiffened but nodded. "His name is Theo." The hunter snorted. "Whatever you call him, he's a danger. Bears belong in the wild, not in someone's house. I'm offering to take care of it for you." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "He's not a threat. He's my family." The hunter's gaze hardened. "He's a wild animal, lady. If you don't deal with him, someone else will. And it won't be as clean." When the man left, Eleanor sank into her chair, her heart pounding. Theo patted over, sensing her unease, and she wrapped her arms around his thick neck, holding on as if to anchor herself. She would protect him no matter what. He had saved her as much as she had saved him, and she wouldn't let fear or hatred take him away. As winter approached once more, Eleanor and Theo stood together at the edge of the woods, watching the snow begin to fall. The villagers' distrust hung over them like a shadow, but they had found something stronger than fear: friendship. Together, they would face whatever came next. The frost had come early that year, draping the mountains and forests in a harsh white blanket. Eleanor had been feeling weaker for days, though she brushed it off as exhaustion from preparing her home for the bitter winter ahead. But this morning, the weakness was no longer something she could ignore. She woke to a deep, aching fatigue that pinned her to the bed like a weight. Even the effort to lift her hand felt monumental, and her head throbbed with every shallow breath. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving the room icy cold. She could hear the faint whistle of the wind outside, but it felt distant, as though the world had retreated into a fog. Eleanor's lips parted as she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Theo," she managed to croak, her throat dry and raw. She shifted slightly, each movement sending a dull ache through her body, and she felt the fever's heat radiating from her own skin. Theo was already by her side. The massive bear sat on the floor, his eyes trained on her with an intensity she had come to recognize. He seemed to sense that something was wrong, his head tilting slightly as he watched her try, and fail, to sit up. She reached a trembling hand toward him, but it fell back onto the bed before she could touch his fur. "Good boy," she whispered weakly, her words barely audible. Theo let out a soft rumble, a sound she had come to know as his way of expressing concern. He leaned closer, nudging her hand gently with his wet nose, but when she didn't respond, his movements became more frantic. He let out a low, mournful growl and paced back and forth by the bed, his claws scraping lightly against the wooden floor. His massive form dwarfed the small room, but he moved with care, as though afraid of disturbing her further. When Eleanor's breathing grew more labored, Theo froze, his ears twitching. He sniffed at her again, his nose brushing against her cheek, and let out a sharp, urgent huff. It was clear that she couldn't help herself, and no one else was there to hear her faint, raspy breaths. For a moment, Theo stood still, his head swiveling toward the door as though weighing his options. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he turned and lumbered toward the entrance, his movements purposeful. The door swung open under the force of Theo's powerful push, and the freezing wind rushed into the room, causing the curtains to billow and the papers on Eleanor's desk to scatter. But Theo didn't hesitate. He stepped out into the snow, the icy flakes clinging to his thick fur, and began his descent toward the village. The path to the village was steep and treacherous, but Theo moved swiftly, his powerful legs carrying him through the deep drifts of snow. The icy air stung his nose, and the cold bit at his paws, but he didn't slow down. His instincts told him that time was of the essence. Eleanor needed help, and the only place to find it was among the villagers who had always feared and distrusted him. When Theo reached the edge of the village, his sudden appearance caused immediate chaos. A woman fetching water from the well let out a shriek, dropping her bucket and scrambling toward the nearest house. Two men unloading firewood froze in place, their eyes wide with terror as the massive bear approached. Someone shouted, "The bear! It's the bear from the woods!" Doors slammed, and windows shuddered as the villagers retreated into their homes, leaving the square eerily silent. Theo stopped in the middle of the square, his breath visible in the freezing air. He turned his head from side to side, scanning the empty streets. His ears twitched as he listened for movement, but all he heard was the faint creak of shutters swaying in the wind. Frustration surged within him, and he let out a loud, guttural roar that echoed off the buildings and carried into the surrounding forest. Inside their homes, the villagers whispered nervously. "What's it doing here?" one man asked, his voice trembling. "Is it looking for food?" "It's her bear," muttered another. "The widow's bear." What if it's turned dangerous? Theo paced the square, his massive paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. He let out another roar, this one more desperate, and pawed at the ground as though trying to draw attention. But no one emerged. The windows remained dark, the streets silent. Theo huffed and shook his head, his frustration evident. Finally, an elderly woman named Agnes peeked cautiously out her door. She had known Eleanor years ago, before the widow had withdrawn from the village, and something about the bear's behavior struck her as odd. "It's not attacking," she said softly to her son, who stood behind her with a pitchfork clutched in his trembling hands. "Look at it as try to tell us something." Agnes stepped out into the snow, ignoring her son's protests. She took a few tentative steps toward Theo, her heart pounding in her chest. The bear turned to face her, his dark eyes locking onto hers, and let out a low, rumbling growl. Not a threat, but a plea. He stepped back a few paces, then turned and looked over his shoulder, as though beckoning her to follow. Agnes hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced back at her son and the other villagers, who were now peeking out from their hiding places. "I think it's trying to lead us somewhere," she said, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "Are you mad?" her son hissed. "It's a bear. Look at it." Agnes snapped, her tone firm. "If it wanted to hurt us, it would have done so already. Something's wrong." She took another step forward, and Theo let out an approving grunt. Encouraged, Agnes followed him as he began to move back toward the forest, glancing over his shoulder to make sure she was keeping up. The other villagers watched in stunned silence, their fear warring with curiosity. Finally, a few others began to step out of their homes, their movements hesitant. "He's leading her," someone murmured. "But where?" "I think it's to the widow's house," another replied. Something must have happened. As the small group of villagers began to follow Theo, the tension in the air was palpable. They kept their distance, their eyes darting nervously between the bear and the path ahead. Theo didn't stop or look back again. He moved with a singular focus, his powerful strides cutting through the snow with ease. The villagers struggled to keep up, their breaths coming in frosty puffs as they trudged up the mountain path. When they reached the cottage, Theo bounded ahead and pushed the door open with his nose, revealing the dark, cold room within. The villagers gathered at the threshold, peering inside with a mixture of apprehension and concern. There, lying pale and motionless on the bed, was Eleanor, her frail form barely visible beneath the heavy quilt. The moment the villagers saw Eleanor's frail, pale form lying motionless in her bed, the weight of the situation hit them. For a moment, there was only silence as they crowded in the doorway, their breaths visible in the cold air of the unheated cottage. Theo, the massive bear who had brought them here, sat silently near the bed, his dark eyes fixed on Eleanor. He let out a low, guttural sound, as if urging the people to act. "Someone call an ambulance!" Agnes's sharp voice broke through the stillness. She turned toward the group of hesitant neighbors, her face lined with urgency and anger. "Don't just stand there. She's dying." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. There was no phone in Eleanor's cottage. She had lived too far from the modern conveniences they took for granted. Finally, one man, Mark, pulled out his cell phone, fumbling with cold, shaking hands as he dialed. "Yes, we need an ambulance," he said quickly, his voice rising with tension. "It's an emergency. An elderly woman. She's unresponsive. Address? It's the cottage at the edge of the woods. Eleanor Matthews." His words were clipped and rushed as he gave directions, ending with a hasty, "Please hurry." As Mark hung up, the weight of the villagers' inaction seemed to lift slightly, but only slightly. They stood awkwardly in the small space, unsure of what to do next. Agnes moved to Eleanor's bedside, her hand hovering uncertainly before gently brushing a damp strand of hair from the woman's forehead. "She's burning up," Agnes murmured. "We need to keep her warm until the paramedics arrive." Despite her commanding tone, she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. Eleanor's skin was pale as wax, her lips cracked and dry. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest barely perceptible. It was clear to everyone present that her life hung by a thread, and without Theo's intervention, she likely wouldn't have lasted the night. The villagers slowly began to move, spurred by Agnes's determination. Someone lit a fire in the hearth, the warmth spreading sluggishly through the cold room. Another neighbor brought in an extra blanket from their own home, draping it gently over Eleanor's frail body. Theo watched every movement intently, his hulking frame curled protectively near the bed. His massive paws rested on the floor, but his dark, intelligent eyes never left Eleanor's face. As the minutes crawled by, the tension in the room grew unbearable. The sound of the wind outside and the crackling fire were the only noises, broken occasionally by the muffled coughs of Eleanor's weak body. Theo let out a low growl, a sound filled with anxiety and frustration, as if willing the ambulance to arrive faster. "Does she even have family?" someone whispered near the door. It was a younger woman, her face pale with fear. "I mean, besides the bear." "She has a son," Agnes replied quietly, though there was a trace of bitterness in her voice. "But he hasn't been here in years. Theo's all she's got now." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, their guilt growing with every passing second. The villagers had known Eleanor for years, but none of them had truly known her. She had become an outcast in their minds, just the strange widow on the edge of the woods with her bear. They had whispered about her, feared her, even humiliated her with their distrust. And now, standing in her home and seeing her helpless, they couldn't help but feel the weight of their own indifference. The sound of sirens broke through the tension, distant at first but growing louder with every moment. Relief washed over the villagers as they rushed to the door, peering out into the dark, snow-covered path. The red and blue lights of the ambulance reflected against the trees as it approached the cottage, its tires crunching over the frozen ground. The paramedics worked quickly. They entered the cottage with purpose, their medical bags slung over their shoulders and their faces set with focus. Theo let out a warning growl as the strangers approached Eleanor's bed, his massive form tensing protectively. The paramedics froze, their eyes darting toward the enormous bear sitting just feet from their patient. "Control that thing," one of them barked, their voice tight with fear. "He's not going to hurt anyone," Agnes said firmly, stepping between Theo and the paramedics. "He brought us here. He's the reason she's still alive. Just let him be." The paramedics exchanged a glance, but ultimately ignored the bear, focusing on their task. They checked Eleanor's pulse, her breathing, and her temperature, speaking in low, clinical tones that the villagers didn't understand. One of them attached an oxygen mask to her face while the other prepared in four, sliding the needle carefully into her thin, trembling arm. "She's critical," one of the paramedics said, looking up at Mark, who had taken charge of the group. "We need to get her to the hospital now." "It's a good thing you called when you did." Mark nodded, his face pale. "It wasn't us," he said quietly, glancing toward Theo. "It was him?" The paramedic frowned, clearly confused, but didn't ask further questions. They carefully transferred Eleanor onto a stretcher, securing her in place before lifting her out of the cottage and into the waiting ambulance. The villagers followed silently, their breath clouding in the frigid night air. Theo lumbered after them, his massive paws sinking into the snow as he trailed the stretcher to the vehicle. When the paramedics began to load Eleanor into the ambulance, Theo let out a deep, rumbling growl. He stood near the back of the vehicle, his large frame blocking their way as he stared at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a primal mix of fear and protectiveness. "You can't come with us, big guy," one of the paramedics said nervously, glancing toward Mark. "You need to keep him back." But before anyone could intervene, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment. Her gaze, glassy and unfocused, landed on Theo. Her lips moved beneath the oxygen mask, forming a single, barely audible word. "Theo." The bear let out a low, mournful sound, his head bowing as though he understood. He stepped back slowly, his movements reluctant, and sat down in the snow, watching as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away into the night. The villagers stood in silence, their eyes fixed on Theo. For the first time, they saw the bear not as a wild, dangerous creature, but as a being capable of loyalty, love, and courage. He had saved Eleanor's life, something they had failed to do for years with their coldness and indifference. As the red and blue lights disappeared into the distance, Agnes placed a hand on Theo's fur, her touch gentle. "She'll be all right," she murmured. "You did good, Theo. You did better than any of us ever did." The village was never the same after the night Theo saved Eleanor's life. What had once been a place of whispers and cold judgment became a community bound by the awe-inspiring tale of a bear's loyalty and love. The story spread far beyond the snow-covered mountains, carried by visitors and travelers who marveled at the unlikeliest of heroes. Theo, the bear who had been feared and shunned, became a legend. In the weeks following her rescue, Eleanor began to recover. The hospital stay had been grueling, but the doctors were amazed at her resilience. "She's tougher than she looks," one of them had remarked with a smile, and Eleanor had nodded weakly, a spark of pride in her tired eyes. Through it all, her thoughts remained on Theo. She worried endlessly about him, wondering if he was safe, if he understood why she had been taken away. But Theo never strayed far from her thoughts, or the village. The bear had returned to his familiar routines near Eleanor's cottage, patiently waiting for her return. Villagers, who once avoided the area out of fear, now made excuses to visit. They would leave scraps of food near the edge of the forest or simply watch from afar as Theo moved through the trees, his massive frame blending seamlessly into the snowy landscape. There was no longer any doubt in their minds. Theo was no ordinary bear. Eleanor's return to the village was marked by a quiet but heartfelt celebration. A few neighbors had gathered near her cottage, clearing the snow from her path and stacking fresh firewood by her door. When the car pulled up and Eleanor stepped out, frail but upright, there was an audible gasp from the small crowd. She looked around, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her lips curled into a faint smile. "It's good to be home," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. But the moment was interrupted by a familiar sound, a deep, rumbling growl that echoed through the trees. Eleanor turned just in time to see Theo bounding toward her, his enormous paws kicking up clouds of snow as he ran. The villagers instinctively stepped back, but Eleanor stood her ground, her arms outstretched as Theo came to a halt just feet from her. He let out a low, mournful sound, his massive head bowing as though to inspect her. Eleanor rested a trembling hand on his fur, her voice breaking as she said, "Oh, Theo, I missed you too." From that day forward, Theo was no longer just Eleanor's protector. He was the village's pride. People began visiting her cottage, not out of pity, but out of a newfound respect. They came with gifts of food, firewood, and clothing, often lingering to share stories about how Theo had become a symbol of care and loyalty. Some even brought their children, teaching them about the importance of kindness and bravery through Theo's actions. But for Theo, the attention didn't matter. His world revolved around Eleanor. Wherever she went, he was close behind, his lumbering presence a constant reminder of the bond they shared. She spoke to him often, her voice carrying through the crisp mountain air as they walked together through the woods or sat by the fire. "They finally see you for what you are, my dear boy," she would say, stroking his thick fur. A hero. The legend of Theo grew with each passing season. Travelers came to the village, eager to catch a glimpse of the famed bear and hear the story from the villagers themselves. Agnes became the unofficial storyteller, her voice filled with pride as she recounted the night Theo had charged into the square, roaring for help. "He wouldn't give up," Agnes would say, her eyes gleaming with emotion. "He knew she needed us, even when we didn't deserve her. And he showed us what loyalty really means." Not everyone welcomed the attention. Some of the older villagers grumbled about the outsiders who now flocked to their quiet mountain home. But even they couldn't deny the change in the community. Theo had become a unifying force, a reminder of what it meant to care for one another. There were moments of tension, of course. Some villagers still harbored a lingering fear of Theo's size and strength, and there were occasional incidents that reignited old doubts. One afternoon, a group of hunters from a neighboring village passed through, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They stopped in the square to hear the tale of Theo, but their laughter and dismissive comments made it clear they didn't share the villagers' reverence. "A bear's still a bear," one of them had said, spitting into the snow. "Wouldn't take much for it to turn on her. Or any of you." The words spread through the village like wildfire, stoking old fears. Some began to whisper again, questioning whether it was wise to keep a wild animal so close to their homes. But Eleanor stood firm, her voice calm but unwavering as she addressed the concerns. "Theo has never harmed anyone," she said, her gaze steady as she looked out at the gathered crowd. "He's not just a bear. He's my family. And if you can't see that after everything he's done, then I pity you." Her words silenced the doubters, and Theo's reputation remained intact. But the incident reminded Eleanor of the fragility of the peace they had found. She became more protective of Theo, ensuring he stayed close to the cottage and away from those who might see him as a threat. As the years passed, Theo's legend only grew. Children who had once feared him now played near the edges of the forest, their laughter mingling with the rustling of the trees. They would leave small gifts, carved wooden bears, ribbons tied to branches, as tokens of their admiration. Theo would sniff at the offerings, his curiosity endearing him further to the villagers. Eleanor, too, found herself transformed. The woman who had once lived in isolation, burdened by grief and estrangement, now felt a deep connection to the community. She still cherished her solitude, but the visits from neighbors and the warmth of their gratitude filled a void she hadn't realized was there. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Eleanor sat on her porch with Theo by her side. She watched as the lights from the village flickered to life, the sounds of laughter and music carrying on the wind. "They'll tell your story for years to come," she said softly, resting a hand on Theo's head. "Long after we're gone, they'll remember the bear who taught them how to care." Theo let out a low, contented rumble, his eyes half closed as he leaned into her touch. For all the change he had brought to the village, his world remained beautifully simple. He had saved Eleanor, and in doing so, he had saved himself. The bond between them became the stuff of legends, told and retold as the seasons turned. And though the years would eventually take their toll, the story of Theo and Eleanor endured, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable connection between two souls, no matter how different they might seem.